You are now entering Nick and Mello's hyperspace.
Hello, I'm Carmelo, and I love the impulsiveness of Kylo Ren.
And I'm Nick, and I find that Kylo Ren's struggle between the light and the dark is one of the most fascinating aspects of his story.
In our journey through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be discussing the miniseries that were released back in 2019 and 2020, The Rise of Kylo Ren, written by Charles Soule. And this is one of my favorite stories, comic stories, and I just thought it would be very fun to talk about with Carmelo.
And you're a big comics fan, so it's really fun to have a conversation about this with someone who's one of your main mediums of consuming Star Wars is through comics. I do it, but I do it as because it's Star Wars. You do it because you love comics. I'm really excited about having this conversation because this is like your medium. This is what you swim, it's what you drink and eat and sleep. Can we start with your sort of general thoughts about why did you want to talk about this specific series in our podcast?
Yeah, so I think this comic in particular, I feel like all the Star Wars comics released in the Disney era have been really good for the most part. This one in particular, though, I think it does a really good job of tying Kylo's story with the sequels. Some of the things that are kind of up in the air or left open, this kind of fills in some gaps for us, and it kind of makes the movies a little more clear. Star Wars has a history of doing this with books and comics, and even other series like the Clone Wars, the Rebels. So this one I just thought was a really good one because right now, as we're talking, we don't really have a lot that kind of fills in the gap between the sequels. There's still a lot of things that are kind of not explained very well or up in the air, and I think this one right now is probably the best one that we have that does that for us.
And it's interesting that correct me if I'm wrong, but except for the novelizations of the sequel trilogy films, there are not really that many other media that are telling us the story of Kylo Ren. I don't remember any. Certainly, we don't have any junior novels or young adult novels about Ben Solo or Kylo Ren. So this is sort of one of the first snippets that we get of, if we can use the old language, of expanding the universe of Kylo Ren. That is quite exciting because there are lots of questions about him. There are lots of issues about him.
You mentioned earlier we don't really have much when it comes to outside of the films regarding his story and what he's up to. But he pops up occasionally, but he's usually not the focal point. He's kind of just as a reference or just plot device. For this we get his thoughts, his reactions, what he's going through, and kind of his side of the story, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I had not read it. You asked me to read it. I read it, and so I have this sort of like very fresh reaction about the series. It was so much fun having High Republic references in the series, and it's sort of a bridge of we're just ending the sequel trilogy. We are about to begin the High Republic series of stories, and so the series almost feels like a bridge, because you were saying that this was released sort of right around the time that Rise of Skywalker was released, and so this is sort of the end of the movies, of the three movies that Disney created, and now we're sort of getting more information of Kylo Ren while at the same time giving us little bits of the High Republic, the Amaxine station that shows up in Claudia Gray's Into the Dark. We get to see it, and I remember reading the novel and I'm like, I can't make heads or tails of this thing. Rings, what? And so it was really fun seeing it here and sort of get at least these artists' notion of what the Amaxine station looks like. Okay, let's talk about Ben.
So, we're not going to do a beat for beat what happens in the story. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you've already read it, and we're just kind of sharing our thoughts. So, we're not a fan of just recapping things because what's the point? But anyway, long story short, this story, like I said earlier, we get to dive into his head and see what he's thinking and what he's feeling. And that to me is the really most fascinating part of this. I know everybody wants to see Luke in his prime and being such a cool character, and it is nice to see, but he's the heart and focus of the story. And I'm glad they took the time to flesh him out and let him drive the story instead of, he's just kind of a side character in his own story. And instead of letting Luke or even Snoke or take over, he's the focal of every issue, and it's good. I'm glad.
Your he here is Ben Solo, correct?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Ben
Okay.
Solo.
Okay.
Yeah, and so one thing that it caught me. I was reading it again before we started, and I read this when it first came out, and I didn't really think about it. I guess reading it a second time, I guess I have more hindsight. There's a line that he says in the fourth issue when he's fighting another uh, Jedi part of Luke's temple, and it really just kind of summed up this whole story for me and just clicked. It made so much more sense. He says to him, and I'm going to paraphrase. I'm not going to open it up and read word for word, but they're fighting, and he says something to Ty, his Jedi kind of friend, and he says to him that, my name, both the light and the dark, kind of both sides of my family, they kind of control me, and that Snoke and Luke, they don't see me as Ben, they see me as heir to a legacy or something like that, or something of that nature is what he says, and that just to me was so fascinating because yeah, in the films, um, that's really his emphasis. That's what they put. He's the son of Han and Leia, and Luke's nephew, and Vader's his grandfather. That's really kind of what's pushed. What everybody knows about him, and
Mhm.
we don't really get to spend time with who he is. It's more what he comes from, and it's one of those fascinating stories that you'll hear people that have a very famous family or father, mother, cousin, brother, whatever, and uh, it's always about that person and not them. And this is just kind of a
Mhm.
classic example of that. And
Mhm.
the way Charles Soule wrote that line, it was just like, oh, it just kind of changes the way I saw the movies for a little bit.
And it's interesting that the sequel trilogy films do point that out, because there's always, what I've always found fascinating about Kylo Ren is the internal conflict
Hmm.
of, I come from the Skywalker family, and my grandfather is Darth Vader, but my uncle is Luke Skywalker, and I am highly influenced by Snoke. And so I love that the comic series, that we get to spend time seeing Ben with Snoke, that there is a little more information about how we get there.
Right.
And that I found really, really, really interesting. Because the film is sort of the passing of the torch from the Han, Leia, Luke story to the new story. Kylo is sort of the conflicted villain, but he's not the focus. He's important. He's really important. But in the comic series, we get to see all of those sort of pre-stories
Hmm.
to the Kylo Ren that we get to meet. But like in the movies, and I think this is something that I think is very similar both in the comics and in the novels, is that there is a gigantic conflict in Ben and in Kylo. That you don't have Ben is never really dead when Kylo Ren rises.
Right.
Um, and what we see in the comic series is how we get from Ben to Kylo, with the really scary last episode, the last number of the comics, when he is sort of finding ways of arriving at that dark side in a very disturbing way. And I like that a lot. Of the four numbers, the last one was really interesting to me. So at the beginning of the podcast, we talked about your love for comics, and I wanted to sort of have a little bit of a conversation about what makes comics different from a novel, different from a film, and maybe using this as an example on how the genre of comics helps us to get the story of Star Wars in a different way.
This comic does a really good job, and reading it for preparing for this podcast, I kind of was, like I said, had hindsight and was looking for certain things. And a couple things I noticed that I really love. We talked about it already, about his struggle between the light and the dark, and how you said that Ben's really never gone away. He's still in there.
Mhm.
Just Kylo, the persona of Kylo, kind of takes over until obviously the Rise of Skywalker. But there's a couple of moments in this comic, and I think you could probably do this in a film, but it just the way that comics are laid out and drawn, it just looks really nice. And there's a moment when he is fighting the other students at Luke's temple. Vo is her name. They're on kind of a ledge, and he kind of force pushes her off. And you see his reaction. At first, he's kind of got this blank stare, but the next panel, right next to it, he kind of has this, "Oh my gosh, what did I just do?" And then he saves her. So like that's a visual cue. Like he's still Ben Solo at the core, even though he's fighting this ongoing darkness. And then we see later, his reaction to meeting up with the Knights of Ren, and they're kind of just killing innocent people. He's kind of like he's all, "I want to be with the Knights of Ren. I'm really into them. Want to join these guys." But then when it comes down to learning what they do and their philosophy, he's like kind of taken back. He's not sure. And we get to see that, reading this in a novel, we wouldn't get to see his facial expressions, his body language. He looks uncomfortable. He's like unsure if this is what he's supposed to be doing.
I don't know if this is something that you do, but this is something I do. And this is something that I love about comics. When you're watching a film or you're watching a television show, there's time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can rewind and watch something again. But in a comic, I have all of the different faces of Kylo Ren in one page, and I can compare the transition that goes from one to the other and go back and go forward and go back and go forward without necessarily having to rewind like you would in the film. And so
Right.
I love that I have the different expressions of Kylo Ren as a reaction for me to sort of get a picture of who he is.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about telling the story through film or telling the story through television that there's a progressive element. And in comics, because it's a series of still images, you're constantly checking. Like I find myself going back to the same page and looking all of these different images because you're trying to make sense of a story by looking at the different images. And you're right. There's that moment in the very last number of the series where it's a series of vertical columns with all of these people. Like Rey shows up, and and Palpatine show up, and so it's really interesting to be able to have almost like this sort of collage of images together, but not through time, but through space. And it's one of the things that I love about comics, that I am able to have multiple things happening at the same time. On film, it has to be one, then the other, then the other, then the other, and you can do things really fast. But here, it's like this composition of images, this composite of images. That's what I want to say. And that I love about comics.
Yeah, and that scene you were talking about at the end with Snoke and Palpatine and Rey and Leia, it's so fascinating because I feel when you see that image, it's kind of happening. All those are happening
It's
simultaneously.
amazing.
It's
It's amazing.
you get the point of view of everybody. They can kind of feel it through the force, and obviously, I think this was probably written when they probably had some kind of insight of what the story of Rise of Skywalker would be. Obviously, with Palpatine and Leia kind of being in tune, they kind of see and feel his transition happening, and Leia as his dyad, they kind of it's just fascinating that this is kind of that's how when I read it, that's kind of what I saw. Like everybody is kind of reacting at the same time, and we get to
Yeah.
kind of see all that how it plays out. And two of them are kind of like, "Oh no," and then the others, "Yes, yes." So it's a it's a real kind of duality that we see. We kind of
Mm-hmm.
going back and forth, and I kind of think that
Mm-hmm.
kind of parallels what he's going through and will go through in the future.
It's a fun way of telling a story about conflict, about internal conflict,
Hmm.
by having all of these different reactions, points of views, all the different elements of his life, his family, the people that have influenced him, his past, his present,
Future.
his future, because we know what the future is going to be. This is all
Right.
happening before Force Awakens. but none of what happens in this series goes away in Force Awakens. It's all there. We just don't know it. We have the conflict, but we don't know the origin of it.
Yeah, Carmelo, we talked about earlier how Charles Soule, the writer, there was references to the High Republic, and of course, this is a very good kind of background information for the sequel trilogy. But as a fan of comics, like I am, and Charles Soule is one of my favorite writers in all of comics, not just his Star Wars stuff. He's written other things that I've enjoyed, but it's really interesting in hindsight reading this and seeing the connections that he has to other Star Wars comics and even his Light of the Jedi novel, which is really fun. You mentioned the Maxine Station. We get to see what it looks like, even though it's a couple hundred years later. Snoke is hanging out there because it's kind of like we learn it's filled with darkness, and it makes sense that Snoke would be hanging out there. But Luke and Kylo Ren, they go, or Ben, I should say, I'm sorry, they go to Elfrona with Lor Santeca, and they're looking for artifacts, and we get to see that in Light of the Jedi, Elfrona at kind of its height and its prime. And then when I was first reading this, Lor Santeca said something about, well, the High Republic era was a time period when the Jedi were exploring the galaxy and reaching out like never before. And when this came out, we didn't know what the High Republic was, so I just thought, it's just kind of a throwaway line. It didn't make any sense. Like, why? I didn't think nothing of it. And then reading this now, I was like, oh, they're hinting at it. They're giving us a little sneak preview. So it's really fun to see. And one of the current Star Wars run that he is writing, Charles Soule, we get to see Luke. So this is pre Return of the Jedi, in between 5 and 6. He goes to Elfrona to look for a Jedi. And that Jedi actually shows up in his Vader series post Revenge of the Sith, and she's one of the Jedi that Vader hunts down. She escapes, and Luke connects with her, and she kind of tells that, she immediately senses, you're Vader's son. This is so that's an interesting.
How interesting.
Yeah, it's very cool. That's how he gets I don't know if I'm not gonna, hopefully I don't spoil nothing, but if you've been to a comic book store, you've probably seen the covers, Luke having the yellow saber. That's how he gets the yellow saber. He goes to Elfrona and finds it there. Charles Soule does a really good job of not just connecting his story, but kind of expanding the galaxy as we already know it, and just connecting these dots. And it's so fascinating.
I'm really curious. I don't have an answer for what I'm going to say, but I'm really curious how certain authors that are doing multiple things are sort of creating threads with the different projects that they do within Star Wars. Because the idea of the Maxine is something that shows up in Into the Dark by Claudia Gray, but it is something that we see in Bloodlines by Claudia Gray that is set before Force Awakens. I would be curious to see if, for example, now that the Maxine Station is a thing that Claudia Gray created in Into the Dark, but they already knew that it was there, and so therefore it can be into the Kylo Ren. I love how all of these things are sort of threading across authors. That this is a Charles Soule story that talks about the Maxine that are, as far as I know, first mentioned in Bloodlines, and it is something that then becomes a real thing in Into the Dark with the station and all of that. It is fun how the multiple Star Warses that we're getting now, the Claudia Gray Star Wars and the Charles Soule Star Wars and the J.J. Abrams Star Wars, are all sort of starting to do this. I like that very much. It's a sort of a fun way of doing things. Who knows what the fans think, but I find it really interesting.
I love it. I think it's fun. Like I said, especially as a fan of Charles Soule, when I read all his comics, it's cool because it feels like being rewarded for paying attention and kind of reading and following along, and it's just really neat. Yep.
All right, sir. That was fun.
Wow. That was good.
Probably more comics to go, but this is a good way to start. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next podcast.
May the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.